Welcome to this conversation organised by the Pearcey Foundation. We encourage you to use the Zoom Q&A function to lodge questions at any stage. As most of you know, the Pearcey Foundation was founded in 1998 following the death of ICT pioneer Dr Peter. For over 20 years, the Foundation's worked to ensure recognition of our past achievements in ICT and to stress the importance of maintaining our capability to innovate rather than be mere consumers of new technology. It does this by annual awards, including the Pearcey Medal and its Hall of Fame for Lifetime Achievement, and awards to younger entrepreneurs in each state. Now, the digital revolution of the communications and computing has transformed our society in the last 70 years. Successive generations of technology have come and gone. Companies have flowered and declined, and it's been difficult for policymakers and the public to comprehend these changes or to grasp the opportunities or the challenges they've provided, or indeed the endeavours and activities that have been necessary locally to keep us on the crest of the wave. Such has been the rate of this change that in the scramble to embrace the next new thing, we've sometimes trampled on the past. As successive waves have come, it's that we put away the existing and forget about it. We've got a responsibility, however, to preserve that heritage and to use it to inform our future. Accordingly, the Pearcey Foundation has established a heritage program with the following objectives. Firstly, we need to capture and record and publish the stories of the men and the women who've kept Australia at the forefront of these remarkable developments. We've therefore commissioned writer and historian Graeme Philipson to generate a new book. You'll hear more of this from Graeme shortly. We also need to ensure the retention and accessibility of artefacts and documents that record our journey in the digital age. We aim to foster cooperation and collaboration among the many groups and individuals who have object collections or archives or other materials, and of course, gather oral histories. These other organisations range from our major institutions such as the Sydney Powerhouse, Monash University and other universities that have important publicly accessible displays, items at Museum Victoria, some of them in museum storage, and the CSIRO and the New Heritage Communications Museum, through to volunteer groups such as the Australian Computer Museum Society and individual collectors. And remarkably, there's quite a lot of material under the control of individual collectors. Fortunately, the technology provides us with the capability to collect and record images, stories, and documents. It also has the capability to make these records accessible across time and space. That's important, of course, in a country as large as ours, where it's not easy to drop in to look at what's in storage or in display in, say, Western Australia, if one's on the East Coast or vice versa. What can tie this together is a virtual museum, along the lines of the Charles Babbage Institute at the University of Minnesota, which we've sort of taken as a model. The Charles Babbage Institute is the custodian of archival material, but more importantly, provides a one-stop shop or access point to other sites and collections. The Pearcey equivalent will also provide the capability for people to contribute stories and other material. And such a portal, though, by no means substitute for the importance of having original artefacts accessible in their locations. As a very keen museum buff, I can't emphasise too much the importance of the real object. But if one can't see or can't visit the real object, at least we can facilitate virtual access across the nation. At the Pearcey Foundation, our surveys have elicited a remarkable level of support from a wide range of respondents for this project. For instance, we're already collaborating with researchers at the University of Sydney who recognise the importance of examining past successes and failures to understand the factors which drive innovation and entrepreneurship. We also see this project as providing a resource for policy making, for school and university curriculum, and to enrich the public experience and understanding of how we got here, how to maintain the momentum, and where we may get to in the future. So this is a significant departure or significant development on our part. For this, we'll of course need support, in-kind support and sponsorship, which we're seeking. And the first of the items, which is by no means the last, but most concrete initial item, of course, will be the book. And I'm now going to ask Graeme Philipson, who is the author of the author of this book, to talk to us. Graeme, well known to most of you, I think, as a historian, an author, a journalist, an industry commentator, and you could also call him an observer and a philosopher with a keen interest in the past and where we might go in the future. So, Graeme, please.
Thanks, Peter, and good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for joining us on this Zoom seminar. Thanks for that nice introduction, Peter. Yeah, I'm passionate about the history of the computer industry. I'm a historian by training. I have a degree in the subject, but I'm passionate about history more than anything. With my history degree, I of course went into computers many years ago, and I've had my whole professional career in computing. But I've become more and more interested in the history of the industry. And the history of the industry is fascinating. Someone asked me once, why is a historian interested in computers? I said, well, in real history, you see the rise and fall of empires and peoples, over hundreds or thousands of years. In computing, you see the rise and fall of architectures or of different computing technologies in a decade or so. So you're seeing all of history condensed into a human lifetime. It makes it very interesting. Computing only began digital computing only began after World War II, and Australia was very early. Only the fourth true computer in the world was Trevor Pearcey's CSIR Mark I, better known as CIRAC. So I've wrote a lot of articles about the subject over my career when I was a journalist, but more recently I wrote a history of the industry. There was no single volume history of the Australian industry. So the Australian Computer Society actually commissioned me to write one a couple of years ago. I wrote it, it was well received, but as I knew would happen, lots of people said after I wrote it, hey, you missed this, or you didn't get this enough emphasis. So I approached the Pearcey Foundation as the custodian of the heritage of the industry in Australia to do a more complete book. And that's now the cornerstone, or one of the key aspects of the revamped heritage program that the Pearcey Foundation is initiating, that Peter mentioned. So the book is underway. It's looking good. I'm very happy with it. We've outlined a structure for it. We're fortunate that computing, it's actually not hard to do a structure, because the decades are quite naturally fall into eras of computing. The 50s was when it was all starting with computers still had names. You see this one behind me, it's called REDAC. That was the fourth computer in Australia at the Weapons Research Institute in South Australia. So the 50s was sort of academic and research computing and the start of commercial computing. The 60s was the beginning of the mainframe era and commercial computing and government computing. The 70s was the heyday of the mainframe and the beginning of mini computers. The 80s were very important. You had the PC revolution, and also the growth of a lot of minis like Prime and Wang and Digital, Data General. A whole heap of major players came in the 80s, and the mainframes gradually began to decline. And in the 90s, mainframes continued to decline, and the internet came into being, or commercial use of it anyway. The World Wide Web and the dot-com boom of the 90s. It seemed like it would never end, but of course it did at around the turn of the century. So then you have another era of cloud computing and social media and such like. So the book is essentially chronological, but a key component of it is biographies of senior people in the industry. We have the Pearcey medalists and Hall of Famers. There's now more than 50 of them since the awards were instituted 20 years ago. And we have other key pioneers in the industry. So as well as just a chronological history of the industry, we'll have biographies of each of these important figures in Australian computing. Australia's computing heritage is extremely interesting. It's packed with interesting anecdotes. It's not at all boring. I have no time for people who say that history is boring. History is the most interesting thing in the world because it's everything that's ever happened until now. And I can assure you that from my perspective, I certainly intend to write a history that is exciting and as fascinating as the subject matter itself. It's not a dry tome. It'll be alive with people and events and innovations. I'm happy. We'll have a question session at the end of this Zoom conference, so I'll stop for now in my description of the book, and obviously I can talk about it later if any of you want to ask a question about it. Thanks, Peter.
Thank you, Graeme. Our next speaker is Maurice Pagnucco, who is Deputy Dean Education at the University of New South Wales Engineering. Maurice was former head of school at the School of Computer Science and Engineering at the University of New South Wales, also the immediate past president of the Australian Council of Deans of IT. And he is, as well as being an academic very much in the computer science space, he's also been involved in projects which enhance museums' experiences by the use of IT. So Maurice, please.
Thanks very much, Peter, and thanks to the Pearcey Foundation for having me here today. I really appreciate it. I just wanted to start a little bit about talking about a bit of my background and why I'm fascinated and passionate about computers and computer science in particular, just to sort of set a little bit of the scene. So many years ago when I was a teenager, I had the good fortune to buy myself a Commodore 64, and I taught myself how to program in BASIC at the time. I'm sure many of you probably had a similar experience. Then when I finished high school, I was trying to figure out what I would do at university. And I thought, well, I know how to program, so I went to computer science. I decided I would do mechanical engineering. And in the first year of mechanical engineering, in the first term, actually, I had to do a course on computer science. And then I realized that my conception of what computing was, and even what programming was quite different from the reality, and that things were much more fascinating than I had really thought. At the end of that term, we had a 3-week break, and I had a textbook on computer science that I hadn't even opened in that term. So I thought, oh, let me read a little bit more about computer science. And so I actually read this textbook from cover to cover. I have a feeling it may be the only textbook that I've read from cover to cover, but I was fascinated. It was a great read, and it started talking about the theoretical foundations of computation, and in particular, it talked about problems that were difficult to solve on computers, and then it got to the point where it talked about problems that you couldn't solve on a machine. And I was going, what do you mean? What do you mean there are problems that you can't solve on a machine? And at that point, I was really fascinated by this subject. And in the end, I never ended up taking up my mechanical engineering degree. I was doing a dual degree, so I did computer science instead, and went on to study computer science. Now, my research is in artificial intelligence, but I do have a fascination for the theory of computation. And I often try and give talks about what the theory of computation tells you is difficult, or as I said, impossible to solve with a machine. Yet why are we able to do such impressive things with computers nowadays? And of course, as you've seen, the advances in machines have led us to some of the great advances in recent computer science, deep learning and so on in particular, not that that's my area of research. Another bit of my background that I wanted to reveal was that when I was an undergraduate student at Sydney University, one of my lecturers by the name of Alan Bromley, who's unfortunately passed away now, had a little computer museum in the foyer of the building in which the department was located. I often go and have a look at the devices that he had. And what was fascinating was that he had devices from mechanical computers through to your more modern day electronic computers. And to see that progression was quite fascinating. I always go and sit there. In fact, he was fascinated with a device called the Antikythera mechanism. Antikythera being an island in Greece. And this island, there was a shipwreck off the island, and around the early 1900s, they were fishing up all the remains of this shipwreck, jars of olive oil and so on. And one thing they fished up was a lump of rock. And when they looked more closely at this lump of rock, they noticed that there were some gears in this lump of rock. And the shipwreck was dated to 100 BC, which was long before they thought that gears had been invented. So he was fascinated by what this device was doing. Now, perhaps a little bit unsurprising in hindsight, they eventually worked out that it was a device for calculating the movements of planets and stars and so on. And now you do have a modern replica. In fact, he tells a great story where he was at so if you go to the Athens Museum, you'll see it in a little glass box. And he tells this great story how he was there one year x-raying it, and it accidentally fell and it split in half. And he thought, oh my God, they're never going to invite us back here again. And interestingly enough, when it split in half, they managed to see some gears internally that they hadn't seen before. So, you know, people have had a long fascination with computing devices from way back. And I noticed that now when I was head of computer science at UNSW, one of my colleagues, Brad Hall, had helped put together a little computing museum out the front of my office. And if you ever have the great fortune to go to Monash University in Melbourne, check out the computing museum they have there, because it's another really great computing museum. Now, the one I have is good, but it's not. It could do with a lot more history in it. But I would always be interested to see how many students would go there and have a look at the devices. And I remember one time walking into a school meeting, and they were showing a video, and it was a video the students had made of their journey through this little computer museum out the front of my office. So even they are quite fascinated with the history of computing. And I'll just end off by saying that, of course, as what I was telling you before, that what fascinated me about computing and computer science was the fact that, you know, as I said, there are problems that are very difficult to solve on a machine, will take you a long period of time, or are impossible to solve. And so what does that mean going forward? Even though the machines are getting faster and better, that doesn't mean they'll make inroads into some of these problems, but we need to really think about how we use this technology to solve some of these really difficult problems. And you're seeing some of that in some of the research that goes on today. As Peter said, yeah, I have done a little bit of work with UNSW's Centre for Interactive Cinema, iCinema, and they've certainly done some work in visualizing collections and connecting artifacts in museums, particularly for Melbourne, the Museum Victoria in Melbourne. And yeah, it's interesting what you can do with computing devices and, you know, tagging your digital assets to be able to help someone create their own narrative and their own journey through historical devices, be they computing devices or other sort of historical artifacts. So I'll stop there, Peter, but thanks again for having me.
Thank you. Thank you, Maury. Our next speaker is Bronwyn Evans. We're delighted that Bronwyn can join us at a very busy time. She's the CEO of Engineers Australia. Engineers Australia has over 100,000 members, and it has an active heritage group with their own heritage program and publications. In fact, CIRAC was designated an engineering heritage landmark by Engineers Australia in 2004. And so our interests obviously overlap. Pearcey Foundation, we see overlap as a good thing, because it's where we like to work and collaborate with others. We've got much to learn from the protocols and practices Engineers Australia Heritage Group have developed over the years. And it's obviously very significant that a professional organisation has such an emphasis on heritage and recognises its importance. So, Dr. Evans, please.
Thank you very much, Peter, and it's a real delight to be here this afternoon speaking with you. Yes, we, as Engineers Australia, we turned 100 in August last year. So we're very much about honouring that, our heritage, but also using that heritage as the platform for the future. And I thought it was quite interesting when Maurice talked about his fascination with computer science. My PhD is in electrical engineering, in robotics and industrial automation. And there are times when, rather than a fascination, there can be a frustration as well. I started coding in Fortran, and if you drop that stack of punch cards, it was catastrophe all round. So maybe there is a chapter in that history of computing about the poor student who stumbles on their way from the punch cards to the computer. But I think this concept of creating an enduring national resource is really important. And as Peter mentioned, we have an engineering heritage society. And the concept there is that we want to be able to recognise the importance of our heritage in engineering to help us navigate the future. And last year, as part of our centenary, we did publish a book, or two books actually, but the one I'll mention is 100 Australian Engineering Projects. And CIRAC is one of those. And it's other things. It is the cochlear implant, it's Wi-Fi, and it's so much more. But that importance of honouring our history is something as a theme that keeps coming up. And I'll give an example where I had a wonderful opportunity to see an engineering university, this time in Japan, and the way they honoured our engineering heritage. At the Kanazawa Institute of Technology, they have a library that holds first printings of books that changed the world. And a couple that I'll mention in particular, they have a first edition of Coulomb's Studies on Electricity and Magnetism, published in 1785. They have a copy of Alessandra Volta's Electricity Caused by Mere Contact of Dissimilar Conductors, 1800. And when you see these books, you just get a sense of the minds that are giving us all of the things we now take for granted. There's Thomas Edison's patent number 297 and 587 from April 29, 1884. So it isn't just about what's happening in the future, but by understanding our past and our heritage, we really get that sense of connection right back to the 1700s, right through to now, and way into the future. And it's no more important now than ever as we're connecting with each other through these digital platforms to understand how we got here. How did Maxwell's electromagnetism shape the sort of energy distribution we've got? How did all of that work shape our computer networks and all of the systems that support it? So I would really congratulate the Pearcey Foundation for creating this virtual museum, because it does inspire you to think about not just the past, but how do I use that for solving problems in the future? So it's really great to be here, and it's great to be able to talk to you a little bit about our heritage engineering group and what we're doing. But also, if you ever have the chance, get to Kanazawa in Japan when we can all travel again and look at their library. It is something to behold. Thank you.
Thank you, Bronwyn. Thank you. It's wonderful to hear that the Engineers Australia, 100 years, and that heritage is still, in fact, more than ever, an important part of the professional organisation. We now move on to Q&A, and we invite you to lodge any questions using the Q&A button, which should be right down at the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, and just close to leave. Don't leave. Q&A, please. We have a chat comment, I think. Yes. Okay. There are a couple of chat comments here. One is, how can people get involved? Well, I think that's probably one for me. How can people get involved? A number of ways. First of all, if you have stories or know of people whose stories have been overlooked, we know some of the leading lights from our award systems and so on, but there are also others whose stories should be told. Please communicate with any of us, communicate with me, or communicate with the Pearcey Foundation. If you have artefacts, handling artefacts is a difficult issue because of space, and it's not something we intend to do directly. But I guess my first advice will be catalogue and identify them and list them so that people know that you've got them, and also it may be that museums or others may wish to acquire them. And also, of course, sponsorship. We are always, Pearcey Foundation is seeking sponsorship for this project. Sponsorship, in-kind support and financial support, always extremely welcome. We have we have a whole lot of comments. Yes, I think we've got one from Barbara. Maurice, can you talk a bit more about iCinema?
Yeah, I can definitely. Actually, I clicked on the thumbs up button for Barbara because I thought I could say, yes, I can answer that. But I realized I promoted that question to the top of the list. So I do apologize for that. Barbara, yeah, I can. So the iCinema Centre, as the name suggests, is about interactive cinema. And interactive means that people are part of the cinematic experience. Now, they have a couple of different platforms. But the one I'll talk about, which I did some work on them with, is a cylindrical projection area. It's about 10 meters in diameter, 3.5 meters high, and there are projectors that will project on the inner surface of that cylinder. So the audience stands in the middle of the cinema and they can see stuff projected around them. Now, some of the early stuff that they wanted to do was around, visiting cultural heritage sites and so on. They had a really interesting early success in that there was a virtual reality and mining research group in the mining school at UNSW. And they, when they developed their software, they went and asked the iCinema people, and iCinema suggested they use similar software. So whereas the mining virtual reality group had started with some monitors in a sort of curved arrangement, they ended up having this 360-degree experience. And that system was then commercialized for occupational health and safety training of miners, coal miners. So you'll probably know that there's coal mines near Sydney, up in down in Wollongong, up in Newcastle, out in west in Lithgow and so on. And so they had these cinemas there so that they could train coal miners before they set foot in those mines. And the experience is quite realistic. One of the pieces of work I did with them was an interactive piece. It premiered at one of the Sydney Film Festivals a couple of years back. It was written by a well-known Australian playwright named Stephen Sewell, and what myself and a student did is we used an AI technique to control some virtual characters that then interacted with the audience members that were inside the cylinder. And the last one I'll just quickly talk about is the piece they did with Museum Victoria. And what was interesting about this is that they sort of had separated out the so-called, the virtual floors of the museum. And you could visualize it both in terms of different categories. So there was a technology floor, there was, an automotive floor. I think there were various different floors of the museum. And then around the cylinder, you had like a timeline, and you could visualize the objects according to when they were dated. And you could then select items and it would give you more information on the items, but also it linked items according to the tags they had so that you could have your own journey through this virtual museum, and they had objects that weren't on public display. So happy to, if you get in touch, I'm happy to send you more information if you like.
Right. Okay. I think the next, I think in time order, Alex, a question about people to figure in the book. The first level of that, of course, we have those people who've already been identified in awards. However, we've established an editorial advisory group with representation in each state and territory, except Antarctica, and ask them also to assist us in identifying people, because some of the people who are significant figures or interesting figures in the past are not necessarily high on the public stage. And one of the examples of this that I think about is that at one stage, the world expert on a particular operating system from one of the leading computer manufacturers was a medical practitioner in Charleville in outback Queensland. Now, not a person on the national stage in some ways, but still a very Australian story and something that that should be included. So we are actually going to we are actually seeking those inputs. Not everybody will be able to get, will we have space for everybody in the book, but at least on associated websites and so on, we should be able to keep biographies and oral histories, even if there's not enough room to put them in a print book. And let me see, I'm looking at timing here. Graeme, you're going to answer a question from Philip?
Yeah, there's a question here from Phil McRae. Hi, Phil. Thanks for viewing and thanks for asking. Phil asked how the existing history. I assume, Phil, you're referring to the ACS history that I wrote about 3 years ago. I'm sort of regarding that book now as almost a training run. It was well received and quite thorough, but as I mentioned in my talk earlier, it contained many errors of omission. I knew it would happen once I'd written the book, that people would say that certain things weren't given prominence or were missed out altogether. Fortunately, there were very few errors of fact. We'll ensure that we have a proper balance. Peter just discussed the editorial advisory board, who will be keeping us honest, as it were, ensuring that we don't miss anything. But I'm very conscious of not making this book a second edition or an expansion of the ACS book. That was a history of the industry, but it figured, the history of the ACS figured prominently, and it was probably, excuse me everybody, was probably more focused a bit more on academic computing, that being a bit of the focus of the society. So the new book will be a lot more looking at the individuals in the industry. It will be a lot more oriented on the industry itself, if you like, the commercial side of computing in Australia, and obviously how that interacts with people. Wayne, Peter, if you're happy, there's one or two other questions for me. Yes. I'll answer one of those now.
Yes.
Two related questions. Will there be a section on computer education in Australia from me, Lou? Yes, there will. This is a very important subject. We must distinguish between computing in academia or tertiary education and computing in secondary and primary education. Australia was a world leader in computing in secondary education with Owen Hill's microbee and other things. So yes, the answer is they'll be well covered. And also a question from Tim Turner on the extent to which the book, so I'm just reading off the screen here. To what extent can the book be prepared to allow of education modules that might be offered to education sector, even for money? We won't charge for it, to support computing education in Australia? That's a really good question, Tim, and thank you for it. I must admit we haven't given that a lot of consideration, but the book will be modularized. It will be electronic as well as print, and making content available for educational purposes will not be difficult. I'd be very keen to talk to you about this. You can contact me through Pearcey or just Google me. I'm pretty easy to find. I'm the easiest person to Google in the world. And happy to talk to you about that, Tim. Thanks, Peter.
Right. I'm looking at the sequence of timing here. I think we've handled Bill, yes. Computer education, yes. Engineering Australia, I think there's a question there from Sebastian. Welcome, Sebastian. About Engineering Australia involved in ensuring that noteworthy artefacts. I think that might be one there for Bronwyn. Are you there? Is Bronwyn still with us? Yes.
Yes, I certainly am. So what are the sorts of noteworthy artefacts that we're looking at? Not so much archiving them, because some of them are fixed engineering, so water supplies and sewage systems and transport. And if anyone lives in Sydney, there is the Annandale Viaduct has one of our plaques on it. So the Engineering Heritage Group really look at all of the different elements of engineering in Australia and have compiled a register. So you can look at our Engineering Heritage website and just see some of those areas that have been already captured in the register. And there will also be some bridges and viaducts and physical engineering in addition to ones related to telecommunications, IT and electronics that have been captured.
Right. Okay. And while we're on the Q&A, Bill Cayley. Hello, Bill. I know about the CMAD, and Damien Dunlop was a student in my department at one stage. I don't think there is one, and that's the kind of thing we should be able to answer quickly by going to a consolidated site. And I'm certainly far more interested in whether there's a CMAD machine out there than whether how many early IBM PCs there are, because this was an Australian endeavour. I'll see whether I can track one down. This is unless you know of one that might make part of a collection somewhere.
Yeah, Graeme here. Can anyone hear me?
Yes.
Graeme here. Yeah, that's a really good question, Bill. The whole idea of this virtual museum is that we will build a catalogue of these sorts of devices. There's no central repository of not just of devices, but of information about them. The virtual museum, we envisage, will have metadata on all of this equipment. It'll say where it is, who's got it. If possible, we'll sort of have a electronic walk around or look around of the device. But one of the most important features of the virtual museum will that it acts as a central repository for both artifacts and documentation pertaining to the history of the industry in Australia.
Right. Okay. Now, looking at chat, there's a couple of very current issues there. From Mike about founding member of Pacific Computer Weekly editorial team. So the question is the preservation of archival material. Archives are always, to me, quite challenging. I think some museums have not caught up with the interlinking between archives and the objects in the way they might. We have a proposal which has just come in the last few days from the Computer Museum Society, which is that they have volunteers who will assist in the scanning of material which could go into a digital archive. That's certainly something that will be within the capability of such a project, because largely what one's doing is digital storage. It's getting the material in that's important. And certainly early computer publications in Australia are very significant. The computer press at the time giving a real insight into the state of the art, sometimes quite amusing, such as when one sees that this machine has a hard drive of 2 megabytes, which is all the storage you'll ever need in your lifetime and things like that. But nevertheless, very important. So we, being in touch and collaborating with people who wish to ensure that such material is available is certainly on our agenda. Of course, one of the other linkages in the long term and a growing facility in Australia is Trove, and we obviously, that's another organisation that we will need to work with. I think we've got another thing there from Rob Bell. Rob Bell, who's collaborating and a great colleague in this space, also working on pointers to other museums and particularly CSIRO artifacts. Rob working with both the Bureau of Meteorology and CSIRO. And I'm just going through the chat line. And once again, from Robertson Dunn, yes, preserving artifacts and physical objects is one thing, documenting material and so on is another. Quite labour intensive, but if we can call upon people who are doing this individually and have a coordinated effort, that would be great. And I see there, Milu, drawing attention to collections at Museum Victoria, and yes, quite a lot of material there. In some cases, once again, it's this question of structure where some of the common collection sites are almost like a smorgasbord of different items, and we have the opportunity with the virtual museum to do some curating and structuring and organisation for people investigating. Okay, what have I missed? Do we have
a couple of questions? There's a couple of questions there, Peter, that I could answer on the question line. Yeah. Phil McRae, another question from you, Phil, on will it draw on Max Burnett's museum material? Well, Max's museum, excellent, of course. We all, well, many of us know about that. He's unfortunately, with his illness, had to divest himself of quite a bit of it, and a lot of it's gone to the US, unfortunately. But importantly, in terms of the book, Max also documented the history of Digital Equipment Corporation Australia very thoroughly, and he wrote a book which he gave to me on CD about 5 years ago, so I have that. He's been one of the few people documenting stuff as it went. IBM Australia has been pretty good. Controlled Data has been excellent. There's an organisation called the Controlled Data Australia Association, and they have a wonderful website of the whole history of controlled data, which was such an important part of the industry back in the 60s that it really covers a lot of other ground as well. There's great resources out there. Max's is one of them, so that'll be important. Bill Simpson Young's asked a very difficult question. Look forward to reading the book. When will it be available? Well, as soon as possible. It's a big job. We're still seeking sponsorship. We've got enough to keep it rolling through, but I'd say realistically it'll be early next year. But remember, there'll be 2 versions of this book. This pertains to the other question here from you, Tim Turner. Will there be electronic form of the book to allow it to be enhanced and increased over time? The answer is yes. We're very fortunate with current technology. The book will be in 3 forms. It'll be a print version, a proper book, a real book, a traditional book. But the great advantage with those nowadays is that you can do print on demand. So you can update the book as often as you need. The book will also be published on Amazon Kindle, which has the lion's share of the electronic book market in Australia, and similarly that can be easily added to over time. But very importantly, as we build the Pearcey Foundation on Heritage website, all of the content on the book, including the biographies of all the people that we're doing biographies of, and all the content will be available on the website eventually. So we've got to work out the structure of that, how to make it accessible, how to catalogue it. But there'll be a lot of content in this multimedia world. All of this stuff needs to interrelate: the artifacts, the reference material, the actual material for the book. All the source material for the book is being catalogued. So we want to do as much as we can to make all of this content, artifacts, archives, material, oral histories, to make all of it accessible, and importantly with the book, which attempts to bring it all together and really curates the whole history, make all that as available as possible. So this is very much a work in progress, but very long answer. Short answer is yes.
Okay, we've a question from Bill Coley about a virtual version of Celiac. I'm not aware of that. There may be, there should be people around who would still be aware of it. Is that's something we should put out as an all stations call? I think it's
it's Maury here.
Yeah.
I saw that question, so I just did a little bit of Googling. Now, I'm not sure how good my Googling is, but I posted in the chat a link to a page that I found that then has a link to a little, I think it's a zip file probably, and it has some executables in there.
Right.
Yeah,
Okay.
Graeme here. I never came across this in my previous research about celiac. It'd be very interesting if it does exist. I seem to vaguely recall from my earlier research that there was an emulator when they moved to the KDF9 at English Electric KDF9, I think it was. I might be confusing that with University of New South Wales. When they moved to the machine that replaced celiac, there was an emulator written so they could run the celiac programs for it. That might be what Bill's referring to. And I don't know though what something would have happened to that when the machine that it ran on was subsequently replaced. But something we should look up. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. The next there's a question from Sebastian that ties in with the whole issue of the virtual museum itself, which is to set up infrastructure. Certainly, there's technology. So the concept for a virtual museum is that we would have linkages to other sites, to physical museums, to collections, to articles and so on, so that effectively what we're aiming for is more or less a one-stop shop where which people will be the first place that people will go when they're looking for material on our heritage, not replacing or trying competing with others, but really supplementing and providing pathways for people to navigate into existing museums and existing collections, with some we may have the capability to store some material, but largely our storage will be digital and and digital links. Of course, how much we can do depends on how much funding we can raise. So there are systems out there which are for museum object collections, and there are also archival systems, and some of them can do both. It's an issue that I've spent some time on in the past, but at the moment they're dissipated and distributed, and we are trying to facilitate access. So a virtual museum will be an access facilitator in a way. Okay, there's a question from Anne Moffat. Hello, Anne. Yes, people do have remarkable artifacts. My general advice, I mean, if ACS branches, and I did ask this a while back when we were doing the ACS project, if somebody in each ACS branch would take on the task of identifying such things locally and maybe being a local coordination group, that'd be fine, and we'd love to collaborate with such a structure. And one can find them among people, individuals who come over a sort of Antiques Roadshow kind of thing, a most remarkable range of items. Some of them not unique, some of them are. And I remember talking on CIRAC to a probers group when a quite elderly woman came up to me and explained that she'd been a decryptor in the Second World War, and she had received the telex, or telegram, whatever it was, the coded message as it was, that said that the war in the Pacific was over, the formal message, and she still had it. To me, my response was, well, that's wonderful, but what's going to happen to it? You know, is it at the back of the bureau? Make sure that somebody else knows about this, and that if so you have significant items, there should be a place that they can go. And often in the long term, that's our major institutions for physical objects, because they've got the responsibility in perpetuity. Yes, if we can elicit where they are, and in some cases maybe find homes for them if they're really important in existing museums. We're not intending to collect objects and store them. We don't have that capability. But once again, it's a matter of linkage. Who's got them? Who might be able to look after them?
Yeah, I might come in there, Peter, if I may. Anne's question refers to some devices that were collected back, or artifacts that were collected back in the 80s by the ACS. I wonder if they still exist. It's certainly the case that I've seen over the years that, sorry, Peter, you're on screen. Should I be on screen? I've seen over time that a lot of people have collected artifacts. I collected them myself. The only organisation I know that's done a job of collecting artifacts, and they've got too many of them, they've been hoarders rather than collectors, is the Australian Computer Museum Society, which has had some problems, but which is reconstituting itself with a lot of new blood at the moment, quite successfully. And I would like to think, and I certainly hope, that there'll be a place for these artifacts. But as Peter mentioned very early in this piece, artifacts and the curation of them, the storage and subsequent display and cataloguing of them is a very, very big job. Not in our purview at this stage, but we really want to cooperate with people that are doing it. Once again, in this conversation this afternoon, it's really occurred to me, and I think to all of us, just how much interest there is in the history of the industry in Australia, which is a great thing. But we've got to get it all together, and that's one of the things that the key aim, indeed, of the Pearcey Foundation's Heritage Project. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. And a couple of comments there, a couple of Q&As from Alex. Yes, outlinks to Seattle Living Computer Museum and MMOC in England should be part of this. And the advisory group, the advisory group, we have publicised it, but we will make sure that we will provide the participants in this the details of the advisory group in each state. And and Bill Coley pointing out there's a Hartley system, Queensland Museum, last seen at the warehouse. Once again, it would be wonderful if we knew where these things were. And it's pretty hard, even if one tries puts a lot of time in at the moment to try and track down things in collections, even if they are somewhere catalogued. So trying to overcome that is part of the purpose here. So we're drawing to the end, I think, of our time, and we've had a good, I think, a good interaction. And for our first of these conversations after we did some at the time of COVID, but this is the first of these. We're planning more, but and I'll talk about those in a moment. But first, I'd like to thank our participants today, those people who've chatted and Q&A or queued at least, and also Graeme And Maurice and Bronwyn, thank you all. And mention that the next online seminar, this is the series of these, is on Wednesday, the 29th of July at 4 p.m. So sort of same time, same place almost. And it's going to be on the role of the ICT community in the future resilience and self-reliance of Australia. And the moderator in that case will be Jordan Green, who's been very active in as an angel and in many other ways, consultant and educator and investor. And that is actually a logical succession from what we've done here. We really, we're not looking at the past just for the sake of the past. We're looking at it because we believe that lessons from it can inspire the future, and also hopefully can inform policy and perhaps inform the public as to how much existing reliance is on the digital world and how that's only going to increase. So I think we're just about at the end. So I thank you all and say cheerio and see you at the next conversation.